and then we can figure it out as we go along.
Sounds good. Yeah, the worst case, well, I'll wing it. I'll do everything in the same screen. So, Shreya, since this is becoming so difficult with the screen sharing and so forth, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll start. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel. We have 3 diverse topics that we're going to talk about, and I look forward to having a good discussion. I am making the first presentation. I'm Shreya Urvashi. I'm from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And yeah, I'll just start screen sharing. So this is my topic. I am going to talk about reimagining the crisis in the Indian university. As I'm doing my PhD on student culture and student politics in Indian universities, this paper is part of that work. In this paper, I'm primarily going to talk about the problems that we have in the Indian university. That we had in the university till the beginning of 2020, and how those problems accentuated and new problems came up when the lockdown and the pandemic happened. I will start with a brief introduction of the Indian universities, and then I discuss the crisis. So the Indian universities, the modern concept of the Indian universities, it was brought to us by the British, and primarily their goal was to the goal was to produce a clerical staff for the empire. But after independence in 1947, when the Indians took over power for themselves, we had to reimagine our higher education system, and it was decided that it would be economically accessible and socially inclusive. The public university system in India was made as an institution to uphold constitutional values, and it has had the dual task of critiquing as well as serving the nation. So while it points out the problems that exist in the country, it also is supposed to give out the solutions that should come out for these problems. I mentioned some statistics here. We started with some 30 colleges in independence, and now we're at 39,000 colleges, and there are 32 million Indian students studying in higher education. The stats are just to kind of show you what the kind of problems that could come up in the Indian university. One is, one second, I'll just, yeah. So the first one is of institutional discrimination. The crisis then comes up of quality of research, public funding, infrastructure, political intervention, and the faculty. I would just talk about a couple of them over here, and then in more detail about the rest of them after this. So the quality of research gets hampered in the Indian university. There are a lot of researches that show that the Indian students, the graduates, are not employable. And then there are studies done on the quality of research of the PhD works that come out of India, and then they are also not always very relevant to the academic world. Now, I won't make this 100% generalization, because it is also the questioning of who does these reports, but then this is still telling of the quality of research and higher education that we have. Another kind of crisis is the institutional discrimination that comes in. It comes from the fact that for the longest time, the higher education space was confined to a very limited population of our society, which was mainly the upper caste and the upper class. Also male upper caste and upper class. So later, due to government intervention and policy decisions, a broader population of our society has managed to come into the university, but still there is a certain discrimination that works in very implicit and overt ways. Yeah, I think I'll just mention this point here. This discrimination can be on the basis of caste, class, religion, and language. So how this works out is that in terms of classroom interactions and also in university spaces. In classroom interactions, there are certain students who are given more time to talk about their points, who are given more encouragement to speak up, and then there are others who are not. Those who are given will have a certain identity, and those who are not obviously come from the other identities. This results in many ways. So I'll also mention language here. Given that we were colonized by the British, learning and speaking in English is regarded as an important tool to be privileged to be in higher education. So those who cannot speak English, cannot write in English, are at an obvious disadvantage from the others, and they're discriminated in a lot of spaces. This also comes out in terms of in the admission processes or in the interview processes, where students who come from vernacular backgrounds, non-English backgrounds, are not taken as seriously as those who can speak in English. And yeah, so how this translates is that students from these backgrounds, they protest, they do demonstrations, and also they, like in a lot of cases, they end up dropping out. And in the very rare instances, there's also cases of fatality amongst them. The other crisis of faculty, public funding, infrastructure, and political intervention are very related to each other. I'll go one by one about them from the next slide onwards. So I'll start with political intervention. This is mostly when the government, the central government or the state or the provincial government interferes with what is being taught in a university. One of the most recent and an obvious example was when the government took out a notice of prescribing what would be relevant research topics, which should be in areas of national priority, and how that had an effect on the kind of research is done in universities. So very conveniently, the areas of national importance were those which did not question the government or what is the status quo of the country. There were a lot of research areas that you could imagine are important, and areas that need a lot of scrutiny but were left out of the list of national priority areas, but because it showed the government in a bad light. The other ways the government intervenes is in the form of, although it is more covert at the level of schools, there is a constant scrutiny done of curriculum also at the higher education level. This includes looking at what is being, the reading lists that are taught in universities and colleges, the kind of subjects that are taught in colleges, and then the government tries to interfere on what should be taught. How it does that is by appointing head of institutions and also appointing faculties in a lot of places via, again, more overt methods. And some subjects are encouraged more than others. That can be seen as in terms of public funding that I mentioned earlier, where some departments and some schools are given more money as compared to other departments and schools, to the extent that some schools do really well and are able to take in more students while other schools have to shut down. Yeah, I'll talk about the faculty hiring in a little more detail here. Recently, actually not so recent, this is going on since the last 10-15 years, where the faculty are hired only for a semester, which is mostly 4 months or 5 months at a time. And they are taken on ad hoc or contractual recruitment. So these are post-PhD people who have a lot of who have expertise in their area, but also have a lot of liabilities and families in life. I mean, one family and a lot of liabilities. And yeah, so giving them employment for 4 months is not something that they look forward to. So why this happens is because then these faculty, one is that they shift to private universities where they get more stable employment. Um, this leads to a decrease in the quality of education that I mentioned earlier, because all the good and the willing faculty shifts to private universities. This also leads to a decreased questioning of the establishment, which basically means that if you are only employed for 4 months at a place, you would not want to question your bosses so much, because you want to get another contract again for the next semester. So thus the status quo of the university is able to continue. And this also leads to closing down of centers, in the sense that especially in cases of centers of gender and caste studies, the faculty a lot of times are not rehired for the next semester, and then those centers are closed down because of having 0 faculty members. Yeah, so everything that I mentioned till here comes out in a lot of ways, but the one way that I'm going to talk about right now is how all of it reflects in student activism. What is student activism is that when students in higher education take up issues that they deem important and fight for it, simplistically put. They hold protest marches, they hold rallies, they hold other kinds of protest reactions, they talk to authorities, they fight with authorities, mainly to make a point. Why students in higher education do it is, as Lipset says here, students constitute a significant proportion of the rebellious elements in their respective societies. As such, they play an important part in political life. So students who come to higher education are a elite minority. They are the ones who are privileged enough to go beyond having the 14 years or 16 years of education in school life that they have. So then they are looked up by the rest of the society, and they are seen as those who would bring changes in the social and political life, and they are the ones who are supposed to look for solutions. So when students fight for issues, they are ideally considered as genuine concerns. Why students are prefer fighting prefer fighting for what is the truth is because after school life in college there is an atmosphere of active learning and critical thinking, and this critical thinking makes them reflect on the society that they come from, and it also makes them reflect on what they are being taught and what they learn and see around them. So this makes them question everything, including their society as well as the education system. And given that they just have 4 years or 6 years in college or in university, they want, as Allback says, is they want results fast. So they fight and they make their voices heard to, for the cause of social justice. Now, student activism, like students have been fighting for all the issues that I mentioned earlier. A brief history would also show that they've been fighting since independence, where they made a very important part of the, a very important constituent of the freedom struggle. And then after that, it was during the 1970s where India was going through a turbulent time politically, where students formed a huge chunk, a significant chunk. And then after that, I think I'd mentioned last year in 2019, where there was the coming up of a new Citizenship Act, not a new act, an amendment of the already existing Citizenship Act of the country, which is seen as a huge population as being discriminatory in nature. It was brought about by the present government, and students in huge numbers came out on the streets to fight for it and fight against it. And as a result, the government entered the sacred spaces of university, like the library, to hit back on the students. Now, this resulted in a huge backlash by the student community and a lot of supporters, and it became into a huge movement all across the country. And starting from end of December, actually middle of December, right till March, there were constant rallies. Education was stopped at a lot of universities, and I mean, education was not stopped. Classes were being difficult to get carried on at a lot of universities, and there were protest marches and rallies every day till the lockdown came in. And when the pandemic came in, the students had to vacate the hostels, had to go back to their hometowns. At a very short notice, sometimes at a mostly at a 4 or 5 hour notice, students had to leave their place and go back home. All the protest sites had to be emptied. The marches had to be stopped at very short notice. Using this to its advantage, the government also painted all over the murals of the protest sites and kind of brought an end to the existence of having protest sites. I mean, the government, the authorities can see this as one of its victories, but the dissent of the student activists is yet to die down. They are still active on social media. There is still a lot of campaigning going on, although there are no physical marches, and it becomes difficult to get everyone to have the same effect as it is online, as it is in physical protests. The dissent continues on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram as well. So this was what was happening because of the pandemic. Now, the new problems that came due to the pandemic was mainly related to the shifting of classes online. Now, India has 32 million students, as I mentioned, and a lot of them come from all of them come from differential backgrounds. So everyone having access to internet and a laptop and a room to study is not always possible. This has led to a certain section of the population not being able to attend classes, and a very minute number of students actually attending classes on Zoom or Google Meet as it is. So this has led to another kind of exclusion. Now, as we're getting reports of exams being held online for the online classes, this is just going to result in those students, especially the first generation learners who already have a hard time coping up in physical classes, not being able to attend the online classes, now missing out on exams and gradually not being able to graduate because of not having access to internet. So this this brings in the idea of how legitimate is our idea of merit, and also the idea of academic productivity. Like how do we base them on, how do we come on them when there is so much exclusion happening at other levels. I'm also a little out of time now, so I'll just end here. This is one of the murals from one of the universities that I go for my fieldwork. And as it shows, I'd like to end with this question of So given that we already have the problems here, like I've tried to put them out, and we can discuss in more detail during the discussion, where do we go from here? We know the problems, we know the crisis, but as a university and as researchers, we need to think about the solution. So I think one of the major most important ideas of what we could do is that all the stakeholders, which is the students, the faculty, the university authorities, as well as the government, come together, sit down, and discuss and reflect on the actual purpose of a public university in the Indian democracy, which was to be socially inclusive and economically accessible, and then come out with ideas on how to do that. Yeah, thank you. That was me. I'd now pass it on over to Cody, who would talk about firefighters in the US.
Let me see here. Okay, so my name is Cody Mannick, and I'm going to be discussing logging, firefighting, and the economics in the United States. So just to give a little bit of a background, I was a DNR wildland firefighter for 3 years for the state of Washington. Throughout my years, I moved up to being a firefighter type 1, which means I was in charge of other firefighters. In this time, I earned different certifications for squad boss, which meant on a large complex fire, I was in charge of 9 firefighters. And then I was an incident commander level 5, which meant if the fire fell within a certain complexity range, I could command it from start to finish. My last year, I was also an engine lead. So I was in charge of a fire engine along with my firefighters that were on my engine. What I did was I was part of the initial attack crew. So if you were to call in a fire, then I would be the one to go find it and start fire suppression tactics. In my 3 years, I've battled over 1,000 fires, everything from a 10 by 10 spot to thousands of acres. The two that really stand out most to me are record-breaking fires in the state of Washington. The Carlton complex was over 200,000 acres and burned over 100 homes. And then the next year, the Ferry Okanagan County complex fire burned over 300,000 acres. So just to give a little background about fire history in relation to forest fires, before firefighting existed, wildland firefighting existed, the forest would naturally try and regulate itself. So if it was diseased or a lot of dead and down, as we call it, which is just dead trees that have fallen down and it's fuel on the ground, it would light itself on fire with rocks clinking together, or lightning storms would come through and it would burn, little or big, until it burned into the green part of the forest, the healthy part, and then it would just stop. When we started to colonize these areas that were heavily forested, like Washington, Montana, Idaho, we started to build in these forests. And that's where the need for wildland firefighting began. Most famously, where we realized how important it was in 1910, when we had the big burn, which burned over 1 million acres in 24 hours across Washington, the panhandle of Idaho, and Montana, all because of lightning strikes and a sudden 60-mile-an-hour gust of wind that blew it everywhere. It was the most devastating fire in US history, and with it burned not only houses, but whole towns. So basically a little bit about forest health to start. On the upper left-hand side of the screen, there is a photo of actually the Colville National Forest, a place where I fought fire, that is typical to what you see when you go out into the woods in a lot of areas. Now, this is a national forest that is controlled by the federal government. So its maintenance is due to the Forest Service in our area. The thing about this photo is that it's very unhealthy. A lot of people think that this is what a forest should look like, and it's not at all. As a firefighter, all I see is fuel and how a fire can start and how quickly it's going to rip through that area. So you see a lot of dead and down, you see a lot of branches hanging, you see a lot of foliage on the ground. It's just not good. So then on the bottom one, this is actually a very healthy forest. It's kind of to the extreme, but what we do as a firefighter is not only fight fire, but we prevent fires. So we'll go on projects to limb and thin out the forest. So we have a 10-foot radius between trees so that they can all grow, they can get the moisture they need, they can get the sunlight they need. We trim up the limbs so that the fire, if it is on the ground, won't climb the tree because of the limbs. Fire on the ground is a lot easier to fight than fire in the air, or a crowning fire as we call it. So forests that look like the top left are what we're facing today as firefighters. There's a lot of areas that look like this because there's not enough logging to mitigate issues like this. I'm going to use my hometown as kind of a case study because it actually came about because of mining and it was cultivated, and then the three main pillars of economic growth there was logging, mining, and farming. Now, when we had all three of those, the town itself was growing exponentially. More and more people were moving in. It was never going to be a huge, big city, but it had the potential to be a cornerstone little like getaway area for people who wanted to live more towards the woods and have a quieter life away from the city with plenty of job potential. But when I was young in the early 2000s, logging got shut down. It was deemed by courts and by activists to save the forest as not unconstitutional, but that area should be protected. I couldn't find why specifically they did make that. We don't have any endangered species that live up there. But anyways, so once that fell through, we had a lot of people leave. We had a lot of jobs fall through. Farming has declined rapidly. We're losing mining, which is a different thing. But this town is quickly going to become a ghost town. Now, the reason this is important is because, to go back to the two fires in 14 and 15, they're really expensive. Fighting fire is not cheap for the state. So every 2 years, the state bodies get together and they decide on what the fiscal year should look like the next 2 years. So they look at previous fire behavior, they look at the potential for fire danger the next 2 years, and they decide an allotment. And this pays for the foresters, that pays for DNR, it pays for extra engines if we need it, for our engines, for all of our gear, whole 9 yards. But the problem is that in those 2 years, each of these fires, the cost associated with the Ferry Okanagan complex was $44.5 million. They had to pull in a lot of resources from everywhere. We even had Australians and New Zealanders coming up to help us. We couldn't throw enough resources at it. Even the smallest of fire is going to cost a lot of money. And the thing with the cost of money is who pays that. So if it's a natural start, like the Carlton was, the state pays that amount. That fire was about $30 million. But with the Ferry Okanagan complex fire, it's difficult because it was actually multiple fires altogether that had the potential to grow together. We were able to stop them from growing together because there would have been nothing we could have done. It would have burned down that entire side of the state. But basically what ended up happening was that one fire was lightning, one was kids setting off fireworks, another one was a car backfiring. So if you are found guilty of starting the fire, you foot the bill. So even if you pull over on the side of the road, want to take a picture of this beautiful forest and you set it on fire, you get that bill. It doesn't matter if it's $1,000 or the $40 million, you are liable for it. Does it ever get paid? Usually not. Usually the state has to take that into account. So fire itself is very, very expensive to fight. So I go back to logging is the answer. And it's the answer because if it is regulated appropriately, like deforestation is terrible, but when you log it appropriately and you have a chunk of land as a logging company, you're going to continue to prep that area that you've logged the year before by burning it over, burning the brush piles, and replanting. So you're getting rid of the diseased trees. You are taking out fuel from a fire. You're preventing natural fire breaks, so it helps us fight the fires. And you're providing so many jobs. So with an area like mine, which is very heavily up in the country, there's very few people, you have to have a reason to come in. So with logging, you have not only the trucks running, you have to have somebody running CAT and somebody at the mill, and you have to have all of these steps in between. You work with DNR to create these roads, which can later be used by the civilians to walk around. They can use it for camping. A lot of the logging tracks are used by firefighters to get into areas that we weren't able to before. So there's just a lot of benefits with it. On top of that, because of where I'm at and everything shutting down, there are no jobs. So it's one of those where last time I looked, 83% of the entirety of that county is on welfare or some sort of government assistance to help pay for things. And they say that way because there's no job opportunities anywhere. We don't have big businesses coming in. We don't have, Amazon's not trying to make a headquarters where we're at. It's just, there's either jobs or there's not. And when you don't have a job, it's not easy to move because then you don't have the money reserves in order to be able to move somewhere else. And finding housing in a place where you can find a job can be very expensive. And I've been there for generations. I'm a section, my dad grew up there. The problem with the government assistance is that it can cost a lot of money. It's a taxpayer-based payment plan that we pay into those who are working, and then later on, they're able to draw out. So if there's more jobs, then welfare can actually be reduced. So that's the first economic boost for the state. The second one is if these people do have a job, then they have money to go out and buy things that they wouldn't before. They're able to take their families out to dinner, which supports local economies. So the restaurants in the towns don't shut down, or they can go to the movies, or maybe there's enough people that we can actually start to build new businesses. So then we're creating more and more jobs with that. But also it's great for the state because then people will want to take vacations and they'll be able to go over to Seattle for a weekend and afford that. They'll be able to go up to Spokane and buy a car that they never were be able to before. So they're putting money not only back into the economy of the local, but of the state as a whole. The other really great thing about it is that when you lower the cost of fire and you lower the cost of the taxes, or not taxes, excuse me, when you lower the cost of welfare that's being put into the state, then that means the state as a whole has more money to be able to pump into itself. The other thing that I will mention is that black logging is something that I highly support. It's a little different. So when you have a fire that burns through as hot and as fast as some fires do, which in 2015, part of the ferry complex only burned national forest. It didn't burn any homes, and it was really hard to get to because there was no roads that we could get in. And it burned so hot and so fast, it did what's called candlesticking, where you take a tree that would look like these and imagine them nothing but white ashy, no branches, no nothing, there's nothing on the ground, it's just desolated. What you do is you go in and those logs are salvageable for up to a year. When you have that, you have a year to pull them out, get them processed, and get them on the market and sold before they're no good. They end up being just firewood, and there's not enough people up there to need 40 to 60,000 acres of firewood. And so what happened was after it was done, the state, so the national forest is split into two up in this area. Part of it is federal, part of it is state. The state jumped on it immediately. They started logging. They sent in foresters in the fall and spring, and they cleaned up all the piles and they replanted. And now there's actually new growth starting, which has just been 5 years since this fire burned through. In the area of the national forest that's federal managed, conservationists over in Seattle fought the logging and they won. So logging had to stop. So now you have all of this fuel that is dead. That's going to take 100 years for trees to regrow. And when a fire burns through there again, it's going to be even worse than it was before. It becomes just a bad one after another. It just rolls downhill and there's no stopping it unless we reintroduce logging back into the community. I think that with the proper procedures, with the proper guidance from the state and federal agencies, you would be able to create not only jobs in logging, but there'd be even a bigger budget for more foresters, for more firefighters. We'd be able to prescribe burn and thin more often because we'd be fighting less fires. So for me, it's a win-win all the way around as a firefighter, but also looking at economically, if you do it correctly, there's no losing. And one of the big arguments with this is, well, what about natural habitats for animals? That's fair, but if we're not protecting the forest that they're living in, then they're not going to have a forest to be in. So we had in this woods, Alaskan gray wolves were reintroduced 2 years before these fires, and now they don't have a habitat because it burned completely down. So they're moving into towns, going after cattle, even going into towns, which is really dangerous because they're very aggressive. So it's either a matter of going in and moving the animals to a different part of the forest where they can rebuild their habitat, or the whole habitat burns down. So I'm going to finish here with just this image. This is a fire that me and my crew was on. That's just what it looks like when you don't have proper forest health and you have trees growing too close and they're dead and down and there's too much fuel loading in an area. There's no stopping that. We can try all we want, as hard as we want, to fight that, but there's no stopping it. And when the fire's that big, you're catching it 3-4 weeks out if you're lucky, if it stays in the direction that it's moving, if it doesn't spot over to another hill, if it doesn't change directions. And there's nothing you can do to slow it down. I've worked on a fire before where you spend weeks upon weeks on a line trying to make sure it doesn't cross, and there's nothing you can do when that wind shifts and it comes across anyways. So to end it all and to wrap up, logging to me as a firefighter, again, is the answer. It just makes total sense. It would be, in my mind, it's ridiculous that we've ever even got rid of it in those areas where we're lacking jobs, where people need jobs in order to move in to increase that economy. And so then it's like the state is having to support us in all manner versus us being able to support ourselves. So if you create jobs, it stops the money going out from fires. It lessens that blow. It creates more jobs in all areas. It has the potential to grow these towns, to spread people out more thinly, so people can live the lives that they want to live, where they want to live, and how they want to live. But also it creates a safer environment, not only for these people, but for animals as well. Because if we can stop their environment from burning down, then they don't have to worry about finding their habitat. So that is where I will end my presentation. Up next is Leah. So do you want to take it away, Leah?
All right, thank you. Cody, my dad was a firefighter, so I had some special appreciation there for your presentation. All right, let's see if I can get started here. Okay, it does not look like I am sharing the part that I want to share, does it? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Are you seeing a Safari window or a PowerPoint?
I see the screen sharing instructions for Zoom.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind taking over my screen share, then I would appreciate that, and I'll just read from my text.
Of course, if you can just stop sharing the screen for a second, I will start mine.
All right, I'll stop. Okay. Okay, great. Great, thank you very much. My paper here is called A Crisis of Expertise, Too Much Expertise, and I'll get right into it. So from any critical perspective, truth and fact are recognizable as those truths and facts established as such by whichever social actors are, at that particular moment of social, cultural, and historical condensation, authorized to establish truth and fact. It is in this sense that I want to address the crisis of expertise that is illuminated in the spectacular presentation of COVID-19 as a specific sociocultural phenomenon specific to this moment in history. While there's considerable work on the crisis of expertise, this has produced a narrative of the problem with several standard variants or offshoots. The replication crisis and other failures of rigor internal to the practices of research and to the production of knowledge, a widespread lack of scientific literacy that makes it easy for people to be drawn in by pummeling waves of fake news, hoax science, and conspiracy theory, and a similar lack of scientific literacy and appreciation among elite non-scientific audiences that produces political, environmental, legal, and informational or educational campaigns of dubiously effective quality. None of these describe the crises of expertise that concern me. I identify a problem at the opposite pole, one marked not by a deficit of credulity in science, but by an excess of it, an excessive award of epistemic, sociocultural, and political license to a capital S science and to the venerated figures who enunciate its truths, enact its rituals, and evangelize its good news of salvation. There's too much, not too little, cultivation, celebration, and privileging of expertise. And we can see this clearly in the spectacular light of the current pandemic, where science slots into global and local discourses as the one true, good, and justified source of all response, policy, and popular action. In the current context, this discourse of scientific might and goodness combines with the discourse of pandemic-born crisis. Pandemic, of course, precisely and exclusively because the acolytes of science declared it so. To produce the spectacular imaginary in which we are now all living. At the same time, the second discourse has helped to bolster the first. Its tentacles of danger making people and their political proxies quiver, and quivering turn or return with renewed faith to the salvific fold of science, capital S. At the same time they plead for science's protection, they shower the Godhead with their precious oils, abnegating their vernacular being and convivial community in favor of submission to the scientific word. In many countries, including Spain, mine, there are government bureaus and task forces dedicated to prosecuting the grossest exemplars of bad science. And all of the major techno firms, such as Facebook and Twitter and so on, whose political effectivity is at some levels as large or larger than that of governments, have announced that they are implementing measures to elevate approved scientific content and remove from the public cyberspace all traces of the misinformation it deems most offensive. This moment and its science exalting narrative then is post-political, rendering the autonomous being of the commons and the debates of the polis altogether irrelevant in the face of this technic administration of life. The long legacy built by 20th century thinkers critical of scientific fetishization, Heidegger, Marcuse, Ellul, Illich, Feyerabend, Haraway, and so on, seems to have found in this dystopic moment its prophetic realization. I intended to reflect conceptually in this paper on the work of Ivan Illich in the light of the now, but David Cayley has already done that, and I'll link to it in the paper I post online. And so I decided to make this a more empirically focused reflection. Join me then, if you wish, for a short flyover journey through Corona World. You're welcome to descend at any of the program stops. In the first leg of the journey, I'll present a few scenes from pre-Corona World that show this crisis of expertise, of too much expertise, already in swing. And in the second leg, I'll show a few more scenes that show it in the Corona world's spectacular light in full bloom. This is only a small paper, and I don't think it's correct to defend it as anything more than an empirically informed critical commentary. For what it's worth, I draw on practices of digital ethnography and critical discourse analysis, as these are used usually with greater depth and rigor, but here we'll take what we can get in anthropology and STS. One final note before we begin the journey, I will post this paper and its slides on my academia page if you'd like to access any of the references or the images with footnotes later on. So getting into the journey, part 1, pre-corona faith and science. A portrait of too much scientific faith already in swing in the pre-corona world. The first thing it seems important to recognize is that what I've proposed is really an excess of expertise, and excessive faith in experts is a portrayal or an argument that runs contrary to the dominating one. The dominant one, of course, is the crisis of expertise understood in standard ways. Let's say, to summarize very quickly, it's that there's too little trust in science and in its experts. Here we can see a few examples in which we can see both sides of the coin. The tremendous popular and political exaltation of scientific expertise, that is my contention that the crisis of expertise is one of too much, and at the same time, the tremendous popular and political identification of a danger that, well, scientific expertise is insufficiently exalted. That is the countering contention that there's too little faith in experts. Consider the march for science, and I guess that's the signal for the first image, whose banner-blazing devotees paced the world's cities to demand more funding and more respect for science. The 2018 was estimated to draw more than 1 million marchers worldwide, and most have a relationship with science only to the extent that they dressed as a science nerd for the 2008 Halloween party at Doc Porter's pub, and or know something about statistics from that time when they calculated the whole team's batting averages back in their Little League days. Regardless of their familiarity with science, capital S science, or the real practice of either one, these enlightened supporters are certain of one thing. Science is good, and it must therefore be respected, protected, and promoted. I think it is important to insist on the point that many marchers likely could not distinguish between a literature reviewing meta-analysis, a bench-based biochemistry experiment, and the creation of a genetic algorithm-trained optimization model. They have not heard of PubMed, stumbled upon Google Scholar, gone to the references, or even considered the possibility that there might be a relationship between methodological design and descriptive or prescriptive power. And when I see people marching feverishly in support of projects, or, let me go further, ideologies, that they don't know much about, or perhaps have no way of knowing much about, but of whose goodness they are absolutely convinced, I stumble backward into the bank of mental images I've accumulated and filed similarly, and I shudder. We can see the dedication to science, the faith in science, in some of the March for Science posters. Here's one where we see, the good thing about science is that it's true, whether or not you believe in it. Another says, show me the data. And a third says, I can't believe I'm protesting for reality. The direct and unbreakable relationship between science, truth, and reality is a crucial aspect of this fervent faith in science. Another sign strikes us now with its ironic hubris. Got plague? Me neither. Thank a science. Science is not only, thank a scientist. Science is thus not only omniscient, epistemically unmatched, it's also powerful. Would they say it is powerful to the point of omnipotence? Perhaps. The kickoff speaker at New York City's 2018 March for Science used quasi, or I would say appropriately, religious language to bind science directly to the good, saying, the sun shines on the righteous and the cause of science is righteous. So we can begin here to see this emerging science of discourse as bound directly and inalterably to the true, the powerful, and the good. Another set of examples I'll offer for an excessive faith in science pre-corona world comes from two collections I've been cultivating for the last 5 years. The first, my ever-growing archive of content for an ever-growing discursive wall of shame, and the second, an archive I call Science Says. Both depict the hubristic, sacralized quality of a science that has acquired the capital S. Here's one headline where we see, "Drink to your health in moderation," the science says. Another, "Many at risk of flu this Christmas, experts say." And very interestingly, one that says, one headline that reads, "Science says the dress is blue." And then there's my personal favorite, "Is it healthy when farts smell? Science says yes." Moving to my country now, consider this notice of alarm from the Spanish government's Ministry of Science that reports with evident alarm and aghast that 20% of Spanish people have used, quote, "pseudotherapies without scientific evidence." Worse again, the alarm is palpable. 2 million of them have used such treatments, quote, "in place of medical treatments." The director of the Spanish Research Foundation referred to, quote, another worrying behavior during her interview. 19% of Spanish people did not consult their doctor before choosing a diet. At the press conference, Spain's Minister of Science and Research evidenced her disappointment that people's trust in science and their use of science to inform their own decision-making was not higher. Her goal, however, was not necessarily or immediately to change the beliefs of the population. And it's worth noting in passing her use of the abstracted population rather than the personal or human people, but to help people, quote, "distinguish between beliefs and certainties." In other words, what you or I might think about X is a belief. Here the intent is clearly to indicate a bad one. What science enunciates about that same X, even if that X is, say, my personal being in the world, is truth, also worthy here of its capital letter form. The next discursive move by the scientific spokespeople releasing this report is impressive. Quote, "We have to keep working with the citizens," again, note the choice of terms to refer to persons like you and me, "to develop their critical thinking skills and help them to filter," here the connotation leans heavily towards filter out, "all that information they get on the internet." But since the population, it seems, is not adequately filtering, the government issued this year a publication naming and denouncing all those alternative medical practices that it ranked as pseudoscientific. Most of you will probably agree that most or all of them are indeed pseudoscientific, crystal therapies, ozone therapies, and so on. But especially in light of the ministry's denunciation regarding the gullibility and acriticality of the people, it seems notable that certain scientifically authorized disciplines and therapies are not subjectable to critique of any kind. That is, critical thinking need not be applied to science because, as we've already established, science is equivalent to truth. Hardly needs reminding that this same truth-bearing medical science is the one that, through centuries and into very recent years, has brought us such scientifically authorized therapies as snake oil elixirs, cocaine toothache drops, heroin cough syrup, electric shock belts for those kinds of problems, trepanation, and everyone's favorite lobotomy. One entire field that does not appear on the list of pseudoscientific therapies is psychiatry, that branch of scientific medicine which, as recently as my own lifetime, brought us homosexuality as pathology and as treatment-worthy pathology at that. In fact, the example of psychiatry is a good one here, allowing us to see the clear narrative union between science and truth. As Foucault writes in the Psychiatric Power Lectures, "The question of truth will never be posed between madness and me for the very simple reason that I, psychiatry, am already a science. And if, as a science, I have the right to question what I say, if it is true that I may make mistakes, it is in any case up to me alone, as science, to decide if what I say is true or to correct the mistake. I'm the possessor, if not of truth in its content, at least of all the criteria of truth. I think that's a great characterization of science still today right there. If this crisis of expertise then is, as I claim, a crisis of too much expertise, how is that crisis of expertise narrative, how is it that a crisis of expertise narrative runs contrary? It seems to me that this is because there's so much trust granted to science and its experts that neither the experts nor the common folk can perceive it. The trust in science, trust in experts, is the ocean in which we fish are all swimming. That brings us to part 2, Corona World. Here I want to portray a few more sketches of this crisis of expertise, of too much expertise. Now, however, the urgency and emergency of the current situation, or the apparent urgency and emergency of the situation, that appear in Corona World's unusual light, urge even the doubters and laggards to believe. And the doubters and laggards seem finally to be catching up and getting into shape. One piece of evidence for this is, well, a very scientific one. Scientists go around every year asking people how much they trust in science, and then transform what people tell them into the apersonal but quantifiable and beautifully graphable abstraction of statistics, which they can put into very effective use in funding proposals. Surprisingly, even the scientific research findings support my position. The German Wissenschaft Association's annual science barometer adjusted its analysis schedule to issue a special COVID edition analysis of the public's trust in science. Quoting directly from its findings report, the overall level of trust in science and research has risen significantly against the background of the corona pandemic. Indeed, between the survey's 2018 edition and this one, the proportion of respondents who confessed a somewhat or complete level of trust in science rose from about half of respondents to about 3/4 of them. Doctors and medical staff enjoyed even higher marks. We can see more color in the concrete of the particular, and we need only page through the popular media to find plentiful evidence that the general currency of this same discourse, science as the ultimate authority, and trust in science as the only sensible, only acceptable response, is alive, well, and energizing. In a May 14th hearing, immunologist Richard Bright testified before a US House committee in an interview that hit the international airwaves with its rhetorical force. The truth must be based on science, and we must listen. Each of us can and must do our part now. In Italy, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, speaking to the Chamber of Deputies on the 30th of April, said, "I'd even call it a categorical imperative that any government facing an emergency such as this one must trust in science." The Washington-based, politically focused US newspaper, The Hill, explained Germany's low COVID infection numbers as a result of the scientific leadership waged by Chancellor Angela Merkel. Quote, "As a scientist, she relied on and trusted the scientific experts to prepare Germany's response against coronavirus. She insufflated," their word, "trust into Germany's citizenry during public appearances where information, honesty, and rigor were a cornerstone of all her speeches." And just yesterday in Spain, the program Entre Probetas, Among Test Tubes, on Radio 5, which belongs to the state-run RTVE, hosted an important member of the Spanish Virology Society's board of directors as its interview subject. He suggested that policy and even society have sometimes been misguided in their priority setting. Here we see the digital binary making worldview of the scientists, placing too much emphasis on economic progress and too little investment in health. But he said, we have to remember, without health, there's no GDP, and without science, there's no health. Obviously, agreed the program's hosts. Indeed, without science, or as I would say, without capital S science, there's no health. It's a lemma that's repeated with such frequency that it's become a lugar común, a commonplace, a banality. Didn't Illich warn us about the surrender of autonomous being in precisely these terms, even to the point of subtitling medical nemesis with them? Medical nemesis, the expropriation of health. Finally, getting to the medius matter, all recent communications from the two men charged with leading Spain's naturally bellic fight against COVID, Health Minister Salvador Illa and the Director of the Center for Health Emergencies, Fernando Simón, not to mention the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, have made science, exclamation mark, their explanation and justification for all of the country's Corona world policy, including its very restrictive state of alarm, effectively a state of emergency, that began on March 14th and is not yet ended. Most people were entirely confined to their homes under threat of strict and aggressively imposed sanctions until May 2nd, when the phase of de-escalation or unconfinement began. What I want to emphasize is the way in that this entire discursive and communicative apparatus has functioned so as to reinforce the inevitable necessity of all the measures imposed. Inevitable because, well, circling back to the maturing discourse I've been referring to, because science says. All decisions are made, and this has become an important word hook for the faithful to clutch onto, on the basis of, quote, scientific criteria. Here we can see a few examples. The first is a May 13th press conference in which the health minister reassured the citizenry of the scientific rather than political motivation for his decisions. A second is a regional news source showing how police departments adopt and deploy the same narratives to justify their strict enforcement of the strict emergency laws. And the same discourse, of course, is not unique to Spain. I've selected a few examples here, the first from Brazil and the second from Mexico, showing the exact same one of scientific criteria as the justification and authorization of all action. The discourse has been tremendously effective, I would say, with uptake filtering down through all levels of government and rooting itself firmly in the local and in the popular. After the province I live in was not approved for de-escalation, the mayor of my small town was unshaken, comforted by her faith in scientific reason, saying, "We can't lose sight of the fact that this decision was made on the basis of scientific health experts, psych, the number of infections and the number of beds in intensive care units. All bases that, on the very small handful of protestive critics later voiced, the province had in fact performed very well." The important point, however, was the first one, that the decision had been made on the basis of scientific experts. Itself an interesting slip of phrase that I think in fact does suggest the embodiment of truth and authority in the very person of the expert. The same discourse was adopted, as indeed it has been adopted from the start of the emergency, by members of the local community. Since the 50 days of near total confinement meant that we've all had to get creative with our methodologies, I did something my anti-technic commitment normally precludes. I went to the web and hung out to see what I could find. I spent more time on Facebook and Reddit than I had to that point in my life. And on Facebook pages and in local groups, I discovered that adherence to the vigorous "it's scientific" clamor was as close to argument-winning trump card that anyone could play. Like the Marchers for Science, it didn't and still doesn't matter to anyone that the contents or methods of science are about as clear to most people as a blizzardy northern day, that there are no sources or evidence ever offered in association with the designated scientific claims in question, or that the logical incompatible of two juxtaposed claims, each supported on the basis of an "it's scientific" justification, might at least throw into question the validity of both. All that matters in this case is the narrative that it's scientific. And since that's about how much time I have, this is where I'll stop. I think this argument about the nature of the crisis of expertise, however, is one very worth having, And if you're interested, I hope we'll have it now, or I hope you'll get in touch. And again, I invite you to download a fuller paper with images and references and links to some other sources that I'll post on my academia page. And with that, I guess I'll return to the group.
Thank you so much for those brilliant presentations. And I guess that's the end of the meeting because we do not have any questions. Thank you.
Oh.
What?
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Shreya, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned the in speaking about the crises in Indian higher education, you mentioned the fact that that English is the language of the university, exposes certain students to discrimination. I also wonder if you have any commentary on what it does to knowledge itself. Obviously, language and the environments in which languages foment, I guess, are the seedbed in which we create our knowledges, our facts, and our world. From your perspective, what is the fact that the Indian university takes place in English? What are the consequences of this on the ways its knowledge can form? Are there certain things that are impossible to think in English that come to your mind, or that it's impossible for certain collectives to name or to characterize in the language of the university?
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to talk about it, but given the less time that we had. So the problems that come with English, one is that everyone who comes into higher education is bilingual, because like at least a bilingual, they're mostly or like 4 or 5 languages. So what happens is that a lot of times you think in your native language, and then you have to translate it every time you converse in academia. That kind of reduces the clarity that you could have had, given that you were allowed to speak in your own language. And the second way it affects is that there is a lot of literature that is only available in English. So then, like say if I'm studying, and like you're also encouraged to write your thesis or your assignments in English. So if I'm say researching like a primitive tribe somewhere, their literature would not generally be in English, and then they remain understudied or even unstudied. So it only exposes a certain kind of literature to come out. And because the language is encouraged, like for people like me, because I have only ever researched in English, like a huge chunk of literature stays away from me, even about student politics. Like there are a lot of archival studies that I just cannot see because I don't know them, and there has never been a translation into English. So like a certain section remains hidden. You're on mute.
When you are able to access other, say, archival sources or written or oral traditions of that are sourced in other languages, and now you need to produce them in the academy, it sounds like you need to translate them to English. Is that right?
Yeah,
well,
that's generally how it is.
Can you give any examples of what kind of problems have presented in your translation?
I mean, I can't have a personal experience because I am not that fluent in any other language except English. But those who do translate, it's mostly that given that you've only, so like, you know, conversational of your mother tongue, and then when you try to translate into academic language, it's a lot of times impossible to write it in the way that is accepted in academic writing. Certain words and certain phrases get misrepresented, or I mean, they end up meaning something very different, or half of the effect comes over. So that also later ends up researching the kind of research that comes out of such works.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there any
Does
other?
Does anyone else here have any questions?
I guess that's a no. Thank you so much for your participation and great presentations. It was very interesting. I guess that's the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.